kids are in Fairfax, right? They're close. They're close, yeah.
We're not live.
It's ex-wife, so.
We're
I
not
think we're
live.
now live.
Yeah, we're not live.
Thank you.
All right. Let's do it. So I'm going to call the Planning and Programming Committee to order, November 21st, 2022. We have everyone except for Mayor Meyer, right? Okay. All right. And we have Councilmember Snyder on the Zoom.
Thank you.
See, you're waving. There we go. There we go. A lot of yellow behind you there. So, all right, very good. Thank you for everyone. We first have the summary notes from the October 3rd meeting. Are there any changes, modifications, or is there a motion to approve the summary notes? So a motion by Chair Wheeler, second by Mayor Rischel to approve the summary notes from October 3rd. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. Mr. Snyder, you were voting yay, I guess, on those minutes? We didn't hear you.
Aye.
There we go. Perfect. All right. All right. The meeting summary is approved from October 3rd. We are now going to go to the recommendation to adopt a transaction update. I'm going to turn it over to. There you go. Go for it. Go for it. It says Chair Wilson, so I'm not doing the presentation. I'm not prepared to. So.
Well, thank you very much, members and members of the committee. We have a short presentation, which I do intend to just run through quickly so you can see what's there. We can come back to any detail that you wish to, because the main purpose of this evening is to seek your endorsement of the recommendation to adopt transaction, to make that recommendation to MBTA at its meeting on December 8th. We did send you the presentation on Thursday of last week. It's almost identical to the presentation we gave to the Technical Advisory Committee and the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee at their meetings on Wednesday of last week. I'm going to kind of cover quickly the feedback from the committees, the changes we've made to the draft plan, and then hand back to you, Mayor Wilson, for the requested endorsement. So in terms of the committees, you've seen some of this information before. The PCAC met in September and in October and offered various comments and asked questions. And for each of these bullets, that's the question, and the sub bullet below each is the response that we either gave at that time or are giving now, as to how we addressed each of the comments that we have received from the committees. So I'm not going to raise any particular one of these. I'm just going to skip over to slide 6, which has the TAC comments from September, and slide 7 has the TAC comments from October. Some of the comments were common across the committees. Some were specific to the committees. This committee met October 3rd. You only met once during these 2 cycles, but we put you in the middle. We've given you two pages in this slide deck for your comments and our responses to them. Let me go through those. Can we measure if MBTA achieved its legislative mandate? The legislative mandate that we follow requires us to do transaction and has a couple of pointers within the code as to how we do that, but there are no specific targets, goals, or measures set by legislative mandate. So our response to this is that transaction is compliant with the Code of Virginia, and that's our primary objective, is to stay within the bounds of the law. How to address the criticism of focusing on roadway projects. Transaction includes 424 projects. That's down 5 from last time we met. I'll explain why in just a moment. It covers multiple modes, but there are no funding commitments associated with any of the projects in transaction. And indeed, the mode of projects that has the highest cost associated with it is actually transit projects, not highway projects. Where do the region want to be in 5 years? This question was focusing on being EV supportive. I think all we can say here from a staff perspective is that your track record, the authority's track record with funding EV projects is supportive of advancing decarbonisation of transit systems. To date, there's not been anything that we've been asked to do with regard to funding that covers any other modes of transportation. And I think in terms of where the region wants to be in 5 years, that's actually more a question for the authority that perhaps as we approach the next update to the authority's 5-year strategic plan, that would be a more appropriate place to address that question. We need to get to the overall larger picture, and I think we've attempted to address this in section 7. And then on slide 9, suggestions about, we need to talk about how we're approaching BRT, and that we have addressed in section 7. Comment was made that success will look different in different jurisdictions, which is something we agree with. On page 19 of the document, which was emailed to you slightly earlier last week, this is addressed on page 19. We do some sub-regional analysis on report that on page 19. There were questions about what's the definition of build and no build. There was a bit of confusing about that, and just to recap, the no build is another name for baseline, and build is another name for the network with all 424 projects included in it. And essentially the basis of our analysis is to compare system performance between the build against the no build in 2045. So I hope we've addressed that. Related to that, actually on here is, on the last bullet, it talks about adding a list of major projects that are included in the no build, because our definition of no build is what's up there today, what's being built today, what will be built soon because it's fully funded. That's our no build. That's the baseline that we compare everything against. We have not included a list of the projects that are in the no build in the revised version of the document, for the simple reason that it gets into a level of granularity which is really inconsistent with the document. There are 84 projects that are MBTA funded projects that are essentially assumed to be in the no build, and there are another 18 projects in the CLRP which are similarly assumed to be in the no build. So to include a list of over 100 projects, is a level of granularity, and frankly I think would probably cause confusion, given that there's a project list which is the projects that we're suggesting will become eligible for funding if transactions adopted, and then another list of projects which essentially is saying these are not eligible for funding because they're in the baseline. So we decided just to focus on the project list that we already had, but we will include this list of projects in the technical report when that is finalised. And I skipped one bullet, which was about wanting to see the difference between now and 2045. And this is addressed in section 4, and we may actually be looking to add one little bit more piece of information to kind of underline that as well. So that's what how we address the feedback from the committees. I'd like to, if I may, just quickly move on to the changes that we've made. I haven't gone through these in finite detail, so this is kind of like trying to capture the bulk of the things that we've changed, and this is all in close alignment with what we've discussed with you previously, but it is obviously now more detailed. So going on to slide 11, looking at the transaction plan documents, some higher level things to begin with. We'd always indicated that we need to beautify the document and make some format changes. So those have been done. The document, the plan document, when adopted, will mostly exist in a digital format. And so we've added MBTA's social media links to the back page of the transaction plan. We've reviewed the document for clarity and added enhancements where appropriate, although we continue to see a few places where we just want to finish that off. We've added on page 3 of the document what are referred to as relevant factors in the development of transaction. So this is kind of early in the document. We wanted to be clear about a number of things which have come up through committee discussion and through public comment. Firstly, that the evaluation of the projects in the project list at the system level, on network level, that performance evaluation is based upon the 10 weighted performance measures that this committee and other committees discussed and MBTA approved in November and December of last year. The second thing is that transaction is compliant with the Code of Virginia. In terms of looking at 2045, all of our forecasts are based on COGS cooperative forecasts. But having said that, transaction is not a land use planning document. So it takes on board the land use planning assumptions which your jurisdictions generate in the first instance and run through COG, but we don't actually have any influence over those land use planning assumptions, but we do use the forecast that emerge from them. And again, I've said this before, I restate because it is important, it isn't always completely understood that inclusion of projects in the transaction project list is not a funding commitment on the part of MBTA, but the project list does form the initial eligibility filter for future cycles of the 6-year program. In other words, you can only fund projects using your regional revenues that are in the current version of transaction, which is the 424 projects. On the next slide, so we've reduced the number of projects from 429 to 424 for the reasons we I think mentioned at the last meeting. Excuse me. We had identified 3 projects that were duplicates of other projects that were already in the list. So we cleaned that up, and then we transferred 2 projects that when transactions started live on this update, we're in our build network, but they're now are not eligible for our build network because they're either under construction or they are fully funded, and they've been shifted to our baseline network for no build. So combination of 3 duplicates and 2 projects being transferred means the number of projects in total went down from 429 to 424. There have been no other changes to the project list. By taking out those 5 projects, a couple of them were quite expensive. That's reduced the estimated project cost by nearly $1 billion, which good news. We're now at approximately $75 billion for the project list, which is where we were anyway, given that these projects are expensive. So we are still looking at total cost of the project list being estimated to be $75 billion, even with 5 fewer projects. And all the costs remain very approximate. One of the major issues that circulated through the committees and through MBTA when you discussed this at your October meeting, when we presented the findings from the public comment period to you, the discussion did proceed to make mention of an emissions reduction line in one of the graphics that indicated 54% reduction in emissions as a result of transaction. The 54% number is good. Maybe what was not so good was explanation of the assumptions that would be required and the ducks would need to get in a row in order for the 54% to actually occur. So the 54% is essentially a best case scenario. We included that. We also included the worst case scenario, which was about 1.7% increase. So excuse me, 54% reduction, 1.7% increase were the best and the worst case scenarios. We've taken out the best case scenario and just stuck with the worst case scenario. In reality, what will happen will depend upon how the region progresses with electrification of the system. So in all likelihood, the actual number will be somewhere in between. And that really identifies the problem we were having is that some of the work we do has to rely on assumptions as to what might happen in the future in order to come up with estimates. And so we've basically gone with the worst case scenario. So hopefully things will actually be better than forecast. And the reason why emissions reduction would go up is because VMT went up. So it's broadly consistent. We also added at the bottom of page 22 a bullet that this is the section of the document that talks about mode-specific results. So we have a highway mode, a transit mode section where we discuss how those systems perform, as subsystems perform independently of each other. And we've added to that a brief summary of how the regional BRT system would perform if we took that out of the transit subsystem. The BRT system, which is combined with what we call high capacity transit, where high capacity transit could be metro, it could be some other form of rail, it could be light rail, and it could be bus rapid transit. Transaction does not get into the detail of which of those it should be. That's really more of a project development issue much further down the road when there's a bit more funding to actually determine those things. But taking into account all of the high capacity transit projects together with the BRT projects, they account for about half of the increase in transit ridership that was identified in the transit system discussion. And I think those projects will account for about 10 billion of the cost out of the 44 billion cost associated with all the transit projects that are in transaction. On the next slide, in section 7, which is the section where we discuss uncertainty and long-range transportation planning, we also refer to this as scenario analysis. We felt this section as a standalone section was drawing a bit too much significance relative to its overall importance. And so to reflect that, we kind of de-emphasized it by incorporating section 7 into section 6, which is the impacts part of the analysis. The scenario analysis relates to the sensitivity of the impacts overall. So it's a part of impacts analysis. It's not a thing that should exist in its own right. So that we consider makes the document smoother, and we keep scenario analysis discussion in there, but more in line with its overall significance in the document. There was one chart that looked at scenario analysis as it affects the build network. And there's another one that actually looked at it, scenario analysis as it affected the no build network. We kept the no build network discussion. That was actually a lot simpler to explain. And we took the other one out because it was disruptive to the flow. The findings from the scenario analysis related to build network is still included. So we focused more on the findings and a lot less on the black box mechanics of how we came up with the findings, because we considered that was not helpful the way it was currently in the document. Obviously, removing section 7 meant that we renumbered section 8 to be section 7. And on page 27, in that final section 7, we revised the key takeaways, strengthened them a little bit, and kind of put them more in the context of how we move from transaction to future funding programs. That's what we did within the plan document that we sent you, and in terms of the project list document we sent you, as I mentioned earlier, we removed 3 updates, and these are explained on this slide. On the next slide, we eliminated the 2 projects that were transferred from the build network to the no build network, and that listed under the first bullet here. That obviously caused a bit of a renumbering of the remaining projects, so that was taken into account as well. Also on the project list on the next slide, we had highlighted previously, we had an incorrect project sponsor and an incorrect project location. That was corrected. So none of this necessitated any change in modeling except for the 2 projects that were transferred because of their size. We wanted just to do a due diligence and just make sure that it didn't change anything significant in terms of the analysis. It did change the numbers, but it did not change the interpretation of the numbers. But we did take the opportunity to update those numbers because we removed those projects. All of these other changes that you see to the project list are not consequential in terms of the actual analysis. It's more of a cleanup, and that sort of cleanup will be helpful if and when those projects are submitted for funding. To have them cleaned up in the project list will make life easier for both us and the applicants as and when that time comes. The other changes that we've made in the documents that we've sent to you, there are some very minor revisions that we would like to make to the document. But we want to make you aware of for full transparency. There's a blank page in the document where we would like in due course to include either a list or group photo or something to acknowledge the authority members and the committee members who've been involved in this work. So that's something that obviously can wait for now. There's still some wording we want to revisit in terms of consistent terminology and capitalization. Things like, should we capitalize the letter P when referring to plan or not? Should we capitalize B, R, and T when we use the expression bus rapid transit? There's some grammar and spelling that we'd like to revisit and clean up if we find anything. We want to make sure there's consistency between graphics and the text that describes the graphics, including titles. If there's anything that's in there which still appears to be suboptimally worded, either text or graphics, we'd like to clean that up. And indeed, on the day of the PCAC meeting last week, we did receive a request from one of the PCAC members to do some wordsmithing on the first page or 2 of the project list, which we're minded to do because it's completely consistent with what is on this list, that is really trying to make sure that the intended audience of the document is not overwhelmed by jargon or any assumptions that we know what we're talking about when we write it, when we put it in written words. So it's those fairly simple things that make a big difference. And then in terms of appearance, the transaction plan, the transaction project list document looks a bit like this, and the plan document looks a bit like this, also with a nice cover. We'd like to put the same or very similar cover back, front and back on the project list to emphasize these 2 documents are a pair of documents within the overall transaction product. So with that, I just quickly go to this slide, which is graying out bullets as we work through them. There are 2 to go. The first one relates to this week and last week in terms of endorsements. I would say, I didn't mention it as we went through, but there's a slide in the presentation that we've got which indicates that both PCAC and the TAC endorsed the recommendation at their meetings unanimously. And you know, obviously we're waiting eagerly to hear your thoughts this evening. And then subject to that, in December 8th, we're anticipating NVTA's adoption of transaction. On this final slide, this is the requested endorsement we have from you, which is also item 3, is listed under item 3 in the agenda, approval of recommendation to the authority to adopt the transaction plan and associated project list. With that, I'm happy to take any questions or anything else you'd like to discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper. Thank you for that presentation. And thanks especially for all the work that get us to this point. I know this is an enormous effort to get us to this place. Mayor Richel.
Yeah, I had a question about how some things fit together. The proposed VRT study that, if approved, it will be in the coming budget. How does the timeline look for the study completion, and then for project sponsors to be able to submit? And would this be accommodated in this transaction update? How is that all going to fit together?
Okay. All right. So I guess for the benefit of not everyone who was at Finance Committee, although Ms. Batten has mentioned this on a number of occasions previously, that there, as you point out, there is a section in the transaction plan which talks about a regional BRT system, which really builds upon the great track record that the authority has already established in funding $500 million worth of BRT projects, which are focused on 5 individual lines, individual BRT lines. Regional BRT system would look to provide, what we proposed to the Finance Committee for the operations budget for fiscal 24 would be an overlay, a BRT preliminary deployment plan, which would kind of begin to look at a system for BRT in the region, as opposed to kind of incrementally adding lines without reference to other lines necessarily in the region. So the advancement of a regional BRT preliminary deployment plan is not itself dependent upon adoption of transaction. It is dependent on Finance Committee recommendation to MBTA and MBTA's approval of the fiscal 24 operations budget. But if all that goes to plan within the current schedule, then what would happen would be that we would structure the work for the BRT preliminary deployment plan to substantially report by the first quarter of calendar year 2025, just ahead of the anticipated call for regional transportation projects for the fiscal 2029, sorry, the fiscal 2026, the 2031 6-year program call for regional transportation projects, which will be anticipated on May 1 of 2025. So that's how it would fit together.
For the potential projects that might come out of the BRT study.
Right. So at that point, there'd be a lot more information known from the regional BRT preliminary deployment plan that would enable jurisdictions and agencies who are interested in pursuing a regional BRT or components of a regional BRT to have information about how the region could go about that systemically, and then incorporate that into any funding requests they make for the FY 2026, the FY 2031 6-year program. They could still do that for the call for projects that's coming up in May, anticipated to come up in May of next year. But if they were to do that, it would be without the benefit of the findings of the preliminary deployment plan. But as the authority has already funded 5 BRT projects, it's entirely possible that we may receive and consider applications in the next funding cycle before the one that I'm referring to that will follow.
And and I haven't gone project by project in the transaction, but there is something like an umbrella coverage that would cover the projects being submitted for funding.
Yeah, it's we can walk you through it. We can identify the specific projects that are in the transaction project list that will comprise the regional BRT system. At the moment, there isn't a straightforward list of those projects, but we can create one. Again, it's not fundamental to the consideration of endorsing the transaction plan or project list, but certainly we can produce that, and definitely as part of the preliminary deployment plan that I mentioned, we would definitely want to highlight that, because one of the reasons for doing the preliminary deployment plan will be to look at putting some greater definition on the potential BRT projects that are in transaction, but are maybe a little bit too far down the road for jurisdictions to really define them sufficiently to make a funding request right now or next May.
This is like the first time we've done something like this, right?
It's the second time we've done something a bit like this, in the sense that it's neither transaction nor 6-year program or a funding program. The first thing we did actually, Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Rochelle, chair and vice chair of our technical Transportation Technology Committee, and that committee has spearheaded the development of the authority's Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. So that's it kind of, the findings of that are integrated into transaction, but it also exists in its own right as a living, constantly evolving document. So that was the first thing we've done. And that was done entirely within MBTA's staff resources, together with the wisdom of the Transportation Technology Committee. So for the regional BRT preliminary deployment plan, it would follow the same model, but it would be a bigger lift. It would involve more, external planning and engineering support than the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, which staff resources couldn't do it alone, but that's still a substantial part.
Well, in the case of the technology, transportation
Technology Strategic Plan.
TTC, that was intended to inform the design of projects that were submitted, or at least provide a standard for projects that were submitted. Whereas the BRT is essentially intended to prompt project submissions that would align to that kind of vision, essentially.
I mean, that's a good distinction. I mean, MBTA does have a track record of funding technology projects as well. It's still, I think, less than $20 million compared to the $500 million of BRT, although technology is, a potentially significant component of any transit or even highway project, because there's infrastructure and then there's operation efficiently, customer information, dispatch support, which is kind of equivalent to maybe transportation management centers that VDOT runs. So there's certainly the TTSP, can steer funding requests that come to MBTA. Indeed, there are a number of technology projects in transaction that really are byproducts of the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. We haven't made, well, we actually mentioned that in the document as well. We had a couple of pages on BRT and I think a page on technology, and they were the only things we really called out in terms of mobile call outs, but then we're not really advocating for them as much as saying, these are truly regional things. If left to the individual jurisdictions, they will be done, but at different rates and potentially in ways that are conflicting, thereby reducing the overall efficiency of the technology by looking at it on a piecemeal basis. And we really want to do the same thing with BRT. What we don't want to do is tell jurisdictions like Alexandria how to design the West End Transitway and the Duke Street Transitway. That will remain a local led issue. But what we're trying to say is, how do these things tie in with Metroway to Arlington, or Vision Route 7 BRT, or Fairfax County Richmond Highway, or indeed BRT that comes across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge? Because discussions about BRT we've engaged with, and they've engaged with us, both Montgomery County and Prince George's County. The interest in BRT goes beyond Northern Virginia.
And Keith did mention, I'm surprised, the BRT working group that we had as part of transaction. And so us being in the position of already having funded 5 different BRT systems and having the working groups, we can see some of the gaps in the network. And BRT doesn't have to look the same. What Alexandria has is different from what Fairfax County has, but we are looking at something that can compete with SOV. Metro Rail is going to take a while to be extended, but looking at BRT can possibly have something online quicker. And it's not in lieu of Metro, but it's to be a complement to the other systems that are in various stages of development. Everything isn't going to look like Richmond Highway BRT, which is planned to run in the median and fixed guideway. Some will be signal preemption, but we are in the unique position as your staff where we can see some of the gaps, and then having the BRT working group help further identify the needs and some of the gaps in the network that, as Keith says, not only go regarding what we're doing, but just really what the COG region, because we did have members of Maryland and WMATA and DC on that working group. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love it, right? I mean, it's good stuff. And I think to the extent we can be a little bit more assertive as a regional entity and bring in the jurisdictions to the water, I think that's great. I think the next step is going to be us trying to figure out how we incentivize jurisdictions to align to kind of a regional vision on some of these projects. And that's probably the next conversation beyond this plan. But I think that's where we go.
So just a few questions, and I'm going to ask an awkward question about BRT. Was any of it in Prince William County?
Yes.
Okay, was it along the Route 1 corridor?
Yes,
I see, because I see Woodbridge to back towards Fairfax, but was it further down?
Yeah, I don't have the details in front of me, but yeah, it does go down Route 1 and also Route 28.
Okay, and into Prince William County,
Yes.
down the length of Route 1. Is that correct? Or
I don't know if it's
remember
up
if it
to.
ends at Quantico with Marine Base,
Okay,
or
but
if
it-
it ends at further up in Potomac Mills area,
Yeah.
but it does extend beyond
Yes.
the Woodbridge area.
Okay, and just a couple, I mean, you would talk about, out of the, let's just round up, $75 billion of projects, 44 of it was transit. Is that correct?
Correct. 44.5, yeah.
Okay, 44.5. And of the 44.5, 10 billion was the BRT sort of vision? Was that the number you used?
The BRT and high capacity transit is about 10 billion.
Okay.
We haven't reported that in here because that really wasn't the purpose of transaction, but we're just adding up the numbers. That's what it comes to. A significant part of the transit cost is related to addressing what Ms. Bateman alluded to. The reason why we can plan for Metro Rail extensions, but we can't anticipate them anytime soon, is before you can even extend them in Northern Virginia, WMATA has got to fix the core capacity problem.
Right. It is,
And so a large chunk of the 44 billion, probably getting on for half of it, relates to what we call a top-down project that has been put in by MBTA staff to look, based on some work that Metro is already doing, preliminary work to look at what the options are for addressing the blue, orange, silver line congestion in Roslyn and then through downtown DC. A big project, that is a big problem. It'll almost all be underground.
and putting in BRT as a precursor 10, 15 years ahead of Metro, I think is absolutely fine. So that I commend you guys for that. I'm going to ask a real sort of basic, I've only been here 3 years kind of question. Transaction is done every
5 years.
5 years.
So
Okay.
technically, you have the authority, you adopt it every 5 years. Our current transaction was adopted October 2017. Now, every 5 years. For us as staff, it starts about every 2.5 years.
It's a 2 or 3 year process.
It is for us to get to the point of the 5-year adoption.
Okay. And then, so the only thing I would say that it's too late to sort of fix now, but it's sort of, is transaction sort of a wish list in a way? Like if we had unconstrained money, we would just, these are the projects we would do, but we would never expect to do them because we won't have enough money. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't use the word
Wish
wish
list.
list.
Okay, sorry.
I
Well,
would,
I'm not very technical.
I would use the word unconstrained because
Yes,
we
right.
use that all the time. It is unconstrained by funding capacity because it is focused on transportation needs.
Right.
Okay, so we look at the needs first. We come up with a list which we admit in here is beyond the funding capacity of.
In that one line, the list that we have here is beyond, we use unconstrained, but the idea that the list we have here is beyond the expected funding capacity, I think it's lost somewhere along the line, because I think that's the major sort of, it is beyond our funding capacity. And people just think, oh, this is what we're gonna do, but it's
Yeah.
not.
And we've said we legally cannot fund everything in transaction because there are projects in transaction that are not located in NOVA. And we say fiscally unconstrained, but it's geographically unconstrained as well because it's truly a needs-based stuff. Yes.
Bridges and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I would, I mean, and I think when I end up talking about it, if I ever do, it's just the idea that this is, you know, we have this of unmet needs, so we will never, through NVTA, meet these needs through this list. You know, but we'll because they're in this list, it does give us a list to work on and chip away at over the next however many years until the next transaction. It has to be in the list to be considered. And so I get, okay,
People don't read, unfortunately.
well, they don't. Or understanding what the word fiscally unconstrained means. I get it, yeah. Like, well, that's why wish list, I know it's not, it's not, you know, it's not very technical, but it, you know, it sort of, it talks of the fact that we don't have all the money. Maybe we will, you never know. Anyway.
All right.
okay. But it's hard work, great, thank you.
Other questions, Jasper, Ms. Backman?
I didn't mean any of us here when I said people don't read. The
Right.
general public does not read enough, the fine print.
Councilmember Snyder.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for a huge amount of work. A couple questions. Well, first a request. Where we're talking about the Route 7 BRT, could you include a mention of the City of Falls Church in there? Because now it's described as Mark Center to Tyson's Corner, and that just makes me paranoid. So just sort of a request, the way we talk about that. And thanks for the work on BRT, because I do think that is going to be a fundamental element moving forward to meet a whole lot of our larger regional objectives, whether it's safety or environmental or equity issues. And so to the extent we can talk about that and move, as you said, of course, consistent with making sure we're working with NVTC as well on the particular work on the BRT. But going back to the report itself, what do we say to people who say, well, the region has set these greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and what does this plan say about that? I think there was a reference in the summary to pages 18 and 19, and then maybe section 7. But how do we respond to people who are very concerned about that particular issue? And what's in the plan that addresses the concerns they raised?
Sure, I'll try and tackle that one. I may defer to my colleague or member of the consultant team, Dahlia Levin, who's also in the room here, and obviously Ms. Backman will chime in if I don't do very well. First off, in terms of the performance of of the projects, that the approach we followed, as I think I briefly mentioned earlier, is based on an evaluation of performance that is built around the 10 approved performance measures, one of which is emissions reduction. But obviously 10 performance measures, when they're weighted, on average, you're going to get about 10% each. So of the weight. So, the emissions reduction is in there. It's part of the overall evaluation. Certainly, there is congestion reduction as part of that performance evaluation as well. I think if congestion is reduced, that offers additional emissions reduction over and above looking at the specific emissions reduction goal, which is more focused on VMT reduction. There are metrics in the document. I think this is one of the ones we touched on earlier, where there was some miscommunication perhaps on our part, misunderstanding on the part of folks reading the document that talks about emissions reduction. And taken as a whole, comparing the 2045 build against the 2045 no build, there is the potential for reduction, but the number that we've reported is actually a small emissions reduction overall. I'm sorry, a small emissions increase overall when you look at all 424 projects. So when you start to break it apart, a number of more things come to light. We have identified that the emissions reduction will be considerably greater with the projects that are in transaction, depending on what else the region does in the meantime. Okay, so there are some things that MBTA can fund in terms of charging stations and other infrastructure and so on, particularly related to transit. But there are bigger things that we cannot control. Noticeably, what do the auto manufacturers do in terms of providing vehicles for consumers to buy? And then there's the consumers, will they buy them? So if the auto manufacturer is not making them and or the consumers aren't buying them, then a lot of what MBTA and other government agencies can do will be constrained. And we've tried to be kind of as clear as we can about that in transaction, that there is the potential for considerable emissions reduction, and the possibility, if the region cannot kind of persuade folks to buy these vehicles, there is the possibility that the emissions reduction will be a lot less.
So I guess where I'm going is if we do the BRT that we're talking about, and we do the other transit, we do the other bike ped programs, it seems to me unduly negative, isn't it? That even if we do all that emissions actually go up. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how, if we do all if we are engaged in, as you said, there's some percentage of value for emissions reductions in what we approve. We're talking very seriously about technology that'll have benefits in terms of the environment. We talk about BRT. We talk about these other programs, and yet emissions are going to go up. That would concern people. And it seems to me a pretty kind of negative view of what we're trying to do here. So help me understand why, if we really were intelligent about what we were doing here, and we provided things that work throughout the region, how do you come up with emissions actually going up, even if we did all that?
Well, the emissions metric going up is just taking all the projects together. But as per our earlier discussion, the region can't afford all of these projects, so that not all of these projects are going to get built. So I guess really it comes down to, for the region, you know, obviously funding capacity, but probably more importantly, and I'm getting into areas where I shouldn't really tread. Yeah, it's about priorities for the region, and that is for authority members to kind of decide as opposed to staff.
Well, and Mr. Snyder, if I could, and now I'm stepping outside of Northern Virginia, but to the entire COG region. I know people look at transaction to think that an MBTA, because you do have funding and you are charged with programming to solving all the woes. But climate change is something that Northern Virginia Transportation Authority will not be able to solve singularly.
Right, I know. Let's just focus on emissions reduction for a minute. All I'm trying to do is say that it seems to me there are a lot of projects in this list that ought to reduce emissions significantly if we're intelligent about how we make selections in the future and again, serve all parts of the region. So it seems to me we ought to be able to say more about what we're going to do over the course of this plan to reduce emissions than we're actually saying in this report. It's almost like we're being too negative about what we're going to achieve. I don't know. I just.
So are you, Councilman Snyder, are you suggesting that when these projects come to fruition, ultimately the emissions reduction impacts are going to be more pronounced than we're estimating as part of this plan?
Yeah, I mean, it's a portion of the grading system, and that may go up or may stay the same or whatever. But I mean, the region made a commitment. We've all, you know, with different degrees of enthusiasm, and I respect all that. But it's like we're being constantly queried on what we're doing on this. And isn't it realistic to assume that we're going to be doing a lot on this in the next 5 years? And do we really say that? And can we find a better way to address the people that are asking that question than we've done so far?
So I'll take a step because I think with this regional BRT study that goes and project preliminary, thank you, Keith, preliminary deployment plan that goes a long way to your point, Mr. Snyder, to getting at regional projects that could really show that we're reducing emissions. Now, for us as staff, because you haven't taken action on the budget, but as Keith noted, I have come to the full authority saying this is what we would like to do. We had the discussion with the finance committee meeting. I'm saying that this is what we would like to do. You will see this in the budget. I think that goes from, okay, transaction being a fiscally and geographically unconstrained plan, and it has a lot of valuable data and tools that how we can reduce emissions. Now let's take that, and then from that was the BRT plan, preliminary deployment plan, and start putting some of that into action. Some of the region is already working on BRT. Other parts of the region are very interested, and I think this plan would go a long way to what if I understand your point correctly, that's showing these are the things we will have in place, or these are the things that we are trying to do. And Mr. Snyder, because you chair the TTC, you are aware specifically regarding some of the technology, the transportation technology things that we have and that we've incorporated in transaction that we're all trying to accomplish as well.
So I guess maybe sort of summarizing it, there is within this plan of projects the capability, depending on how we decide in the future, there is the capability to do a lot about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's almost like disparate pieces need to be pulled together and that statement made. And I'll leave it to you as to whether and the rest of the group as to whether you're comfortable. But I just think there's a lot in here that potentially moves in that direction, and I'm not sure we're stating it in a way that expresses that. So anyway, I'll leave it there for now.
Councilmember Snyder, perhaps in the same way we're trying to be more assertive around BRT and technology, we need to have a similar regional investment on how we assist jurisdictions in seeing these projects as vehicles for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And maybe it's a regional investment that we make to do something similar to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just since we're talking about this plan, there is the capability with this plan to make a huge difference, not just in terms of the traditional sort of transportation metrics, but also in terms of the related metrics of safety, equity, and the environment. And I'm not sure we address that enough in the plan document as it now stands. Thanks for being able to raise these points.
Thank you, Councilmember Snyder. Other questions, comments? Okay, so at this point, you're looking for a motion to endorse?
So moved.
Okay, there's a motion by Mayor Richel. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Chair Wheeler. Any further discussion?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just a request that we take a look at that and see if there isn't a way to address it between now and when we vote on this. And then I'll vote yes in favor of this if we make an effort to take a look at that, at the issues that I've raised.
All right. Staff understands what Councilmember Snyder is looking for here.
Yes.
All right, I see nodding, vigorous nodding. So, all right, any other questions before we vote? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. We have recommended approval to the full board. All right, we are now going to the NBTA update, and I'm going to go to Ms. Beckman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be brief. At your December 8th meeting, in addition to asking the authority or seeking the authority adoption of the transaction update, we will also have the 2023 legislative program. It will look awfully similar to the 2022 legislative program. The only thing we dropped, I should note, is the ability to meet remotely, since we do have that in some capacity. Number one, though, is to protect the dedicated revenue sources and powers of the NBTA. Number two is restore annual long-term funding to the authority to pre-2018 levels. We do have an outstanding balance of $38.5 million from the $102 million that was diverted to Metro in 2018. Number three is protect Virginia's dedicated transportation funding, because not only do we want NBTA funding to be protected, we want all of Virginia's funding to be protected. And then number four is support the use of effective transportation technology. I know last year there were a few bills regarding technology. We want to make sure that we're in support of effective use of transportation technology, especially as things evolve when it comes to transportation technology. And lastly, if there are no questions, I would like to thank you all as a committee. This has been a long ride and a milestone year, because we actually updated the 6-year program. I know that seems like a lifetime ago, but the authority took action on that in July. We updated the 6-year program and transaction in the same year. We will not be doing that again. But thank you, because all of your work, 2 years plus meetings, I really want to thank you. And I also want to give thanks to Keith and the planning team. Last week at the PCAC meeting, one of the council members thanked me. I'm just regurgitating to some extent, not fully, what Keith and the planning team is telling me that's coming out of the models and all of the work in the meetings and the public involvement, and Dahlia with consultants. So I really, really want to thank them. We didn't realize how this year was going to go. New model and a lot of different things, but I do want to say thank you. And you really have a great team working for the authority.
We're very grateful.
And that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Mayor Richard.
We're very grateful.
Yeah, we absolutely are. Thank you so much for all your work. Now you guys just go on vacation now for the rest of the year, is that what it is?
It would be nice, but no.
It really is a
To kick
huge,
back.
amazing analysis of our region. And it has some meat to it. It's not just glossed over. It has some real, information, which is just astounding. So thank you.
Thank you. But speaking of vacation, I think now the committees will not have to meet
All right, that's good.
as frequently as we have been meeting.
Councilmember Snyder, I think, is on vacation somewhere. He's sitting in the beach house somewhere, so.
Like a-
I'm on to you, Councilmember Snyder. That yellow background. That's way too cheerful, that's right, yeah. All right, any other comments? Yes, Mayor Richard.
I just want to say, I think the BRT study is extremely important. BRT is very important because it, in addition to being so very cost effective and important, it's something that we all can agree upon. And I think we do all agree upon the importance of BRT. So, thank you.
I agree. Always fun when you guys are following Alexandria's lead. I always enjoy that. I always enjoy watching that. So you guys keep doing that. That's fun. All right. Anything else for today? All right. Well, have a great Thanksgiving, everyone.
Have a good one.
See you on December 8th. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have fun at the beach, Councilmember Snyder.
Thanks, everybody.